So the unusual pain syndromes we usually come across in our OPD are complex regional pain syndrome, trigeminal autonomic cephalgias, hemisensory syndromes, restless leg syndrome, severe pelvic pain syndrome, burning mouth syndrome or burning feet syndrome, and short-lasting headaches. So to answer the question that why are we calling these syndromes to be unusual, these syndromes are usually associated with excruciating pain, which may be occasionally described as the worst pain known to mankind, despite the lack of structural correlate. These patients may not have any well-defined anatomical correlate. They have a dubious pathophysiology and are frequently misdiagnosed due to associated autonomic, dermatologic, and musculoskeletal features. So a similar case was seen in our OPD. He was a 33-year-old male who was a wood chip cutter and came to the OPD with the complaint of persistent excruciating pain in his left hand and forearm for the last 8 months after sustaining an injury to his left hand at work. He also gave history of severe allodynia, that is severe pain secondary to any non-painful stimulus like a simple touch or a gush of air. For these complaints, he had to carry his left hand supported by his right hand all the time, causing him severe functional disability. On examination, he had dystrophic nails, decreased hair and sweating in his left hand, along with mild edema and hyperpigmentation in the involved regions. He also had generalized atrophy of the wrist and the forearm muscles. We got an X-ray done for him. The X-ray of hand and the wrist was suggestive of significant osteopenia, which was evident in the X-ray in the metacarpals, the proximal and the distal phalanges, as are depicted in the photograph by the arrows. This was another patient that we saw in the OPD, which was an 80-year-old female who complained of severe unexplained shoulder pain for the last 3 months. She was having associated symptoms of hyperpigmentation around the shoulder region, and there was significant and severe motor movement restriction at the shoulder joint. So what is the symptoms that we see in complex regional pain syndrome? This is a picture that depicts the clinical features of complex regional pain syndrome in the form of a mnemonic, that is STAMP, representing sensory complaints in the form of allodynia, hypo or hyperalgesia, hypo or hyperesthesia, trophic changes in the skin, hair, and nails, autonomic complaints in the form of increased or decreased sweating, swelling, or edema, and motor complaints in the form of weakness, contractures, and atrophy. This is a picture that denotes different conditions, and it grades these conditions on the basis of the pain that is associated with these conditions. And this condition is showing, this grade is showing the CRPS to be more severe than the most severe conditions that we know about the mankind, that is the amputation and the labor pains. The diagnostic criteria, that is the Budapest criteria for CRPS, states that the patient should have a continuing pain that is disproportionate to any inciting event. The patient should have at least one sign in 2 or more of the categories mentioned below, that is the sensory, vasomotor, pseudomotor, and motor trophic changes. The patient should also report at least one symptom in 3 or more of these categories, and there should be no other diagnosis that can better explain the signs and symptoms. This picture represents the pathophysiology of CRPS, which comprises three of the main domains that interplay together to cause the symptoms. These are the neurogenic inflammation, the autonomic dysfunction, and maladaptive neuroplasticity. This maladaptive neuroplasticity is secondary to peripheral and central sensitization, and these three domains form the basis of different treatment modalities that are available for CRPS, like short-term treatment of corticosteroids are helpful in the neurogenic inflammation, and sympathetic blocks may be helpful in case of severe autonomic dysfunction. And for maladaptive neuroplasticity, modalities like physiotherapy occupational therapy, and graded motor imagery are helpful. So the treatment that was given to the patients who presented with such symptoms to us in the OPD was prednisolone was given 0.5 milligram per kg per day for 2 weeks, which was tapered over the next 6 weeks to 0.2 milligram per kg per day. And these patients were followed and re-evaluated at 3 months of starting the treatment. Partial responders were given 1 or 2 repeated courses of the same doses for 2 months of duration and re-evaluated after 3 months. The outcomes were that there was significantly decreased skin discoloration and edema. Patient had a marked improvement in the pain complaints, and there was increase in the bone density and marrow edema, along with improvement in the motor complaints. This is the picture showing the before and after treatment picture of the first patient that we discussed in this presentation. As you can see, the patient gave history of significant improvement in pain and functional status. There was also evident improvement in the hyperpigmentation and muscle wasting that was present initially. This was the second patient, the old lady we discussed with the severe shoulder pain. She also had significant improvement in her pain, along with improvement in the hyperpigmentation and the joint motility. This was another patient that presented to the OPD with the 2 months complaint of persistent forehead pain, which was associated with hyperpigmentation and eyelid edema on the left side. He also responded nicely to the treatment, and 3 months later, his post-treatment photograph shows significant improvement in the hyperpigmentation and lid edema, along with significant improvement in his pain complaints. Now I will call upon Dr. Ankit to continue on to the second topic of today. Thank you.
Good morning, respected teachers and dear colleagues. I will talk about the trigeminal autonomic cephalgias. I would like to start my discussion with a case presentation of a young man. PSP, periorbital region, side lock for 15-30 minutes, associated with ipsilateral lacrimation. 2 to 10 attacks in a day. Path score of 8. Here, similar last 1 year, associated with ipsilateral redness, lid edema, and inophthalmos, or decrease in the aperture of the ipsilateral eye. It was diagnosed to be a case of migraine, and prophylaxis was started, but he did not respond to the treatment. What could be the differential of this patient? So the differential diagnosis could be cluster headache, which according to the International Classification of Headache Disorder 3 is defined as the very severe unilateral pain, mainly in orbital, supraorbital or temporal region, of 15 to 180 minutes of duration, with 1 to 8 attacks in a day, with ipsilateral autonomic features. And another feature of cluster headache is circadian periodicity, that is, attacks occur at similar times throughout the 24 hours for several months, usually at the night time. And annual periodicity is the cluster period occurs at the same month or season every year, and duration of cluster period is strikingly consistent for a given patient. The non-trigger of cluster headache is alcohol, and pain responds to the oxygen inhalational therapy. Another differential could be paroxysmal hemigrania, which is defined as the severe unilateral pain in the same orbital, supraorbital or temporal region for 2 to 30 minutes, 5 to 50 attacks in a day with ipsilateral autonomic features, and prevented absolutely by indomethacin. As we have seen, the previous patient did not respond to the high flow oxygen therapy, but he responded to the indomethacin treatment. Cluster headache is one of the most painful conditions known to mankind, also known as the suicidal headache. Difficult to differentiate from the first attack of acute migraine or paroxysmal hemicrania. Another patient who came to the OPD, middle-aged man with headache, which is lateralized to right periorbital region, for 2 to 4 minutes in duration and 10 to 15 attacks in a day, with VAS score of 8 since last 1 month, with associated ipsilateral hearing, and associated redness. As we can very well appreciate in this video, patient had severe pain, PAS score of 8. So this is SUNC or SUNA, that is short-lasting unilateral neuralgiform headaches with conjunctival injection or tearing, or SUNA is short-lasting unilateral headache with autonomic features, which is defined as the moderate to severe unilateral pain in orbital supra of 1 to 600 seconds, at least 1 attack in a day, in a pattern of single jab or series of steps or sawtooth pattern with ipsilateral autonomic features. And the non-trigger of SUNC or SUNA is cutaneous stimulation. There is no refractory period between the attacks. The different patterns of SUNC or SUNA are appreciated in this video. A 65-year-old female presented with single stabs of pain every time she touches her forehead, as can be appreciated in this video. Another 60-year-old male presented with series of steps, spontaneous steps with ipsilateral tearing from the right eye, as can be appreciated in this video. Now the fourth type of trigeminal autonomic cephalgias is hemicrania continua, which is defined as unilateral pain in orbital, supraorbital or temporal region of duration of more than 3 months with continuous pain with acute exacerbations in between, with ipsilateral autonomic features, and it also responds absolutely to indomethacin therapy. Now I would like to briefly touch upon the pathophysiology of trigeminal autonomic cephalgias. Although the pathogenesis is not entirely understood, though the pain is mediated by activation of trigeminal nerve pathways, autonomic symptoms are due to the parasympathetic outflow and sympathetic dysfunction. And the periodicity, as seen in the cluster headache, suggests a defect in CNS cycling mechanisms that is likely related to hypothalamic dysfunction. The mechanical nociceptive stimulus from fifth nerve distribution traverses by the trigeminal nerve to trigeminocervical complex and ascends to brainstem pain nuclei, hypothalamus, thalamus up to the cortex, while the parasympathetic activation via the superior salivatory nucleus to sphenopalatine ganglion traverses via the facial nerve responsible for the lacrimation, eyelid edema, and redness. Trigeminal parasympathetic overactivation also results in perivascular edema, compromising the carotid canal, leading to the neuroplexus injury to postsynaptic sympathetic plexus, hence leads to meiosis in ophthalmos. Now we come to the treatment of different types of trigeminal autonomic cephalgias. First is the cluster headache. The acute attack can be avoided by high flow oxygen therapy at the rate of 12 to 15 liters per minute, or by subcutaneous sumatriptan, while the paroxysmal hemicrania or hemicrania continua can be avoided by indomethacin. As the headache of SUNC or SUNA is of very short duration, that is 1 to 600 seconds, so nothing can be done at that time. While for the maintenance therapy or prevention of further attack, in cluster headache, short course of steroid, verapamil or lithium can be given. In paroxysmal hemicrania or hemicrania continua, the attacks are absolutely prevented by the indomethacin. Other drugs that could be used, celecoxib, verapamil. In SUNC or SUNA, the drugs that can be given are lamotrigine, topiramate, and gabapentin. In refractory cases, the surgical procedures can be tried, like the microvascular decompression of trigeminal nerve if there is aberrant loop around the trigeminal nerve root exit, or the ablative procedure of trigeminal nerve, occipital nerve stimulation, and deep brain stimulation to region of posterior hypothalamus and ventral tegmental region. Now I call upon Dr. Swanshu to discuss more about another unusual pain syndrome that we usually encountered in OPD.
Very good morning to all the respected professors, seniors, and my dear colleagues. So here is your window to our neurology OPD. To have a bird's eye view of a patient presenting with an unusual pain syndrome, let us please have a look at this video. So to summarize, this is a 42-year-old male with no major medical comorbidities presenting with severe left-sided body pain associated with numbness, hearing loss, and visual blurring on the same side since the past 7 years. Let me tell you that this was the patient who had presented to neurology OPD with variable complaints each time. Last year, he had presented with complaint of left-sided weakness. This year, he had presented with complaint of left-sided sensory disturbances in the form of pain, numbness, and tingling. And also with that, he had associated complaints of left-sided abnormal body movements. On examination, it was found that sensory modalities were impaired on left side with a sharp midline transition. Usually in neurology OPD, different sensory patterns that we encounter are as follows. Either they may be in distribution of peripheral nerves such as carpal tunnel syndrome, or they may be in a polyneuropathic distribution, or they may be in a polyneuropathic distribution of a mononeuritis multiplex pattern. They may be in the distribution of a nerve root, which is called as radiculopathy, or they may be involving the spinal cord, in which 3 types of syndromes are possible. The first one is complete spinal cord injury, in which there is a complete sensory loss below a particular spinal level. Or there may be Brown-Séquard syndrome in case of hemisection of the spinal cord, in which there is ipsilateral loss, joint position and vibration sense, and contralateral loss of pain and temperature. Or they may present with central cord syndrome in syringomyelia, in which there is a dissociated and suspended sensory loss present. Or there may be involvement with cross sensory deficits such as pain and temperature on one side of the face and the other side of the body. Such deficits are usually seen in case of brainstem injury. But the patient that we discussed earlier had presented with a complete hemisensory involvement with a sharp midline shift. This type of pattern is usually seen in thalamic or parietal lobe injury. So whenever we encounter such a case in OPD, what runs in a neurologist's mind is Digerine-Drowsy syndrome, that is post-thalamic infarct syndrome, or parietal pseudothalamic syndrome, or pure sensory lacunar stroke, or fibromyalgia, or CRPS, or somatization symptom disorder, or complicated migraine. We did review many literature articles for the study of such an entity. While we were studying, we found out there is an entity called hemisensory syndrome, which was described either as complete hemisensory syndrome or partial hemisensory syndrome in the form of chiro-oral, that is involvement of hands and the face near the mouth, or isolated oral, or chiro-oral pedal syndrome. And majority of such hemisensory syndromes in literature were described in association with pure sensory stroke, the location of stroke being either in the parietal cortex or corona radiata or thalamus or midbrain pons or medulla oblongata, as shown in the data. Various studies corroborated the same finding. When we saw this patient, our first suspicion was that of a functional disorder. Why? Because had the sensory loss been organic, then there would have never been a strict midline splitting of symptoms, because the intercostal nerves, they are overlapping 1 to 2 centimeter on either side of the midline, and therefore we suspected this patient to be having a functional disorder. Now, to stamp it as functional, it was very essential for us to rule out organic sensory loss, and for that we performed a few tests. The first test that we performed was yes or no test. We gave sensory stimulus to the patient and asked him to tell yes if he perceives it and to tell no if he does not perceive it. And yes, we observed that whenever we had given a stimulus on the left side, patient immediately responded with the answer no. The second test that we performed was force choice test. In this test, 2 different sensory modalities were applied on 2 different sides, and the patient was asked to choose between one particular modality. And in this test, we had observed that sensory perception was present on the left side when asked. The other test that we performed was Boulez-Courier test. In this test, a complex hand position such as that shown in the figure is given. By this, we tricked the patient to manipulate his presentation. And when we did this, we did find our patient to be confused about which side is the sensory involvement is. We also confirmed the absence of organic cause for such a presentation by doing MRI in all of our patients, and the MRI was normal for this patient. Now, there we were in a dilemma. What should we call such patients? Should we label them with pure symptomatic labels such as hemisensory syndrome? Should we label them with non-diagnosis such as medically unexplained syndrome? Or should we label them with psychosomatic or hysteria or functional or conversion disorder or factitious disorder or somatization disorder or Briquet syndrome or just malingering? So when we were in a diagnostic dilemma, we again reviewed the literature. When we reviewed the literature, we came to know that hemisensory syndrome in association with functional disturbances was first of all reported as an entity in the year 1885 by Jean-Marie Charcot. But to our surprise, this was a neglected entity for a whole century after that. Charcot during his lifetime had done extensive research on this topic to find out the exact pathophysiology of hemisensory syndrome, but there was no yield obtained in his research studies. In the early 21st century, that is in the year 2002, C. Toth had performed a study to yield a diagnostic yield of hemisensory syndrome. In this study, 34 patients were taken and the median duration of study was 42 years. The study's main purpose was to get a diagnostic yield. In this study, only one patient had yield in MRI, and therefore the diagnostic yield of hemisensory syndrome was just 3% in this study. Association with other comorbid conditions were also studied in this study. Major medical comorbidity associated with hemisensory syndrome was found to be migraine, and the major psychiatric comorbidity found to be associated with this syndrome was major depression or personality disorders in the form of anxious personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder, and also an association was found with generalized anxiety disorder, dysthymia, and other syndromes. Now, we were interested very much in this study as this had been an always neglected topic in the field of neurology. We have been seeing these patients day in and day out in neurology OPD. So we had easy access to a wide number of patients presenting with different kind of hemisensory syndromes. Majority of patients that were presented to us had hemisensory syndromic complaints in the form of heaviness or pressure or cramp or tingling or numbness or squeezing or worm-like feeling. So we undertook a prospective control study over a period of 3 years in which we had taken 65 patients of hemisensory syndrome and compared that with two groups. One of the group was a symptomatic group, and that was for chronic low backache, and the other control consisted of healthy population. In our study, we had found that the mean pain severity as assessed by visual analog scale was 6.2 plus or minus 1.26. And the major triggers found out in our study were minor trauma and infection in majority of cases. As this was a functional disorder, it was essential for us to assess for the presence of psychiatric comorbidities in patients of hemisensory syndrome. And we found higher prevalence and statistically significant prevalence of somatization disorder in patients of hemisensory syndrome as compared to patients of chronic low backache and healthy control patients. We had also seen the stress to be more prevalent in patients of hemisensory syndrome as compared to patients with chronic low backache and healthy control patients. While studying the association between anxiety and hemisensory syndrome and anxiety assessed by GAD-7 scores, we had found that the mean scores for the GAD-7 were significantly higher in hemisensory syndrome patients as compared to chronic low backache patients and healthy control patients. While studying an association between depression and hemisensory syndrome, the depression being assessed by PHQ-9 score, we had found the mean PHQ-9 scores of hemisensory loss patients to be significantly higher as compared to that of chronic low backache and healthy control patients. We had also assessed pain catastrophizing scale in our patient. Pain catastrophizing scale is an objective scale to quantify subjective feeling of pain. Pain catastrophizing scale, the advantage is that it does not necessarily need to have the patient on presentation in pain, because this scale is dependent on what the patient thinks about the pain and how does he feel when the patient is in pain. The three key parameters assessed in PCS are rumination of pain, that is thinking again and again about the pain. Second thing is magnification of pain, that is the threat perceived with a painful stimuli. And the third one is significant helplessness that the patient feels with pain. We in our study had found that the mean PCS scores in the patients of hemisensory syndrome were significantly higher as compared to chronic low backache and healthy control patients. The significance of PCS lies in the treatment. If the PCS scores are high, it indicates the treatment refractoriness of the pain. Now, we were interested in the pathophysiology of such a syndrome. Pathophysiology for hemisensory syndrome has not been well defined in any of the literature articles that we reviewed, but from our study and the general pathophysiology of pain, what we understand is as follows. Triggers such as direct trauma or infection will cause release of pathogen-associated molecular proteins. These pathogen-associated molecular proteins will cause release of chemokines and will attract the inflammatory cells towards them. When these inflammatory cells are attracted, they will cause release of cytokines and neuropeptides. These neuropeptides are just like the peptide hormones. They act in an autocrine and paracrine fashion to act distantly from the peripheral nervous system, and they act on the CNS. What they do is they alter the neurotransmission at various synaptic levels. This process is called as neuromodulation. Whenever there is an coexisting psychiatric comorbidity such as anxiety or depression, there is an already disturbed neurotransmission. And in the presence of this background altered neurotransmission, whenever neuromodulation occurs, there is loss of cortical inhibition of pain, thus causing excessive EPSP generation and perpetuated nociceptive impulses leading to pain. Now, this was the presumed pathophysiology for the mechanism of pain in psychiatric disorders. But why should psychiatric patients have just hemisensory syndromes? Isn't this a question to be pondered on? So we had a suspicion that perhaps there are some changes which are going on at the microstructural level, even though the MRI of all patients had been absolutely normal. So to identify these microstructural changes, we thought that perhaps there was a need of advanced MRI imaging or functional MRI imaging. To address this, a study was done in the radiology department of SGPGI under respected Professor Dr. Sunil Jain sir and Dr. Neeraj Jain sir, and they had used arterial spin labeling and diffusion tensor imaging study. In arterial spin labeling, increased blood flow was found in contralateral thalamus, and in diffusion tensor imaging, decreased function anisotropy was found in contralateral thalamus, and decreased mean diffusion was found in contralateral corona radiata. So this does confirm our finding or our suspicion that there are some changes going on at the microstructural level, which are yet to be explored. Perhaps if large-scale studies are done on the right and left tract separately, these may probably explain the exact pathophysiology of hemisensory syndrome. But we are yet to pave a way to find an evidence-based explanation about this. Talking about the treatment of hemisensory syndrome, first of all, one needs to develop an understanding about disease in the patient. There have been no randomized controlled trials as of now for the treatment of hemisensory syndrome. But The few therapies that have been tried are cognitive behavior therapy, physical rehabilitation, and pharmacotherapy in the form of tricyclic antidepressants, SSRIs, and SNRI. Now I shall call upon Dr. Varsha ma'am for introduction to another unusual but interesting pain syndrome.
Thank you, Dr. Swanshu. Good morning, respected teachers and my dear colleagues. So, moving on to another form of unusual pain syndrome that we see in our OPDs. This is short-lasting headaches, and these are different from the group that we have already seen. So, let's discuss first a case scenario. So just to summarize, this 45-year-old gentleman had two types of headaches. One that started about 5 months back. He felt that he had something running across his head, right from behind his ear to the forehead on the left side. It persisted for 6 hours and it was quite severe with a visual analog scale severity score of 8. Though he has had similar such episodes of shorter duration after that, but they have not been as severe. The second pain this gentleman describes is a circumscribed headache, which is also a paroxysmal headache, which is occurring in a well-defined circular area for a few minutes, and he's having 4 to 5 such episodes every day, which gets relieved on pressing on at that point, and the severity scale was comparatively less, that was around 2 to 3. So if this gentleman would have come to any OPD, or for that matter, in a neurology OPD about 20 years back, he may have been characterized to be a psychosomatic pain syndrome. But this won't be the first time. Around 7000 BC, when the first evidence of neurosurgical evidence came out in the form of Neolithic skulls and by literature, it was found that ancient man believed that certain disorders like headache, madness, epilepsy were due to demons possessing the person, and these could be treated by drilling holes in the patient's head, and trepanation was the procedure it was commonly known as. So these have found way in the literature for the treatment of headache as back as 7000 BC to latest in the 17th century, when physicians used to prescribe this for severe refractory intractable migraine patients. So our gentleman had a type of headache which was an epicranial headache. So what are these epicranial headaches? These are the headaches which are known to arise from scalp tissue or bone or from the epicranial nerves. They share a certain common features, that is, they are well circumscribed, they are focused on some stemming point, they have burning character, they don't have any accompaniment of migrainous feature or any autonomic features, and they usually get relieved by certain peripheral pain blocks. So according to the International Classification of Headache Disorders, this was classified into 3 headings, that is nummular headache and primary stabbing headache, included in the other primary headache section, and epicrania fugax, which is not characteristically described and has been included in the appendix of headaches. So what are these pain syndromes? Epicrania fugax, this is a brief paroxysmal pain, stabbing or crawling quality. It moves in a linear or a zigzag trajectory, though it was classically described to be occurring from posterior to the anterior region, but now several variations have been reported in the form that it can go from front to back, it can extend to the face, or they can have a coronal transmission as well. The common feature is that it usually commences and terminates in different distributions of different nerves. Nummular headache, it is a very rare headache occurring in around 6.4 people per 1 lakh, and it is a coin-shaped headache occurring in a small circumscribed area, which should have all the 4 of these characteristics: that it should be sharply contoured, fixed in shape and size. It can be either round or elliptical. It is in the area of 1 to 6 centimeter in diameter, with a highly variable duration, that sometimes it has been reported to be episodic and sometimes it has been known to be continuous. The third type of headache, that is primary stabbing headache, the prevalence of this is highly variable. In earlier studies, it was reported to be as low as 0.2 to 2%, and now in certain surveys of the population, it has been known to be as high as 30% and is also known as ice pick headache. It is characterized by ultra short localized jabs or jolts of pain, which occurs for only a few seconds, and classically around in more than 80% of the patients have been described to be occurring in less than 3 seconds. So because of its benign nature, people usually don't even come to the OPD for it. It is very irregular in frequency, that it can happen only a single episode in a whole day or to several episodes in per day. It is not associated with any cranial autonomic symptoms, and it is not better classified by any other diagnosis in the ICHD-3. So why do these pains occur? The pathophysiology is not very clear, but from what we could understand was that the pain stem or pain starts in some of the epicranial tissue. It is also related to the hypersensitivity of the peripheral nerves and leading to a neuropathy. The spread of these or the radiation of these pains is though not very well categorized and is having two hypotheses. One is when there is a peripheral extension to the surrounding nerves, either by paracrine measures, or there is involvement of the trigeminal cervical complex and having a central component to the radiation of these pains. So these pains, we decided to look into our patients and enroll such patients. Why? Because probably the studies that have been done do not do justice to these headaches, and there are far more common cases than only as described in the literature, that it is not very rare. So we included such patients in the last 6 months, and we found that other than these well categorized entities that I've just described, there are certain undefined entities that we found. These are: the first patient is that of nummular fleeting type, in which the pain starts in a stem in a nummular form and it travels to certain other region and then to third region or a fourth region in a jumping fashion, not following any nerve territory. The second was the mixed type. In a single patient, we found both the components of nummular headache as well as epicranial headache. So we included 20 such patients, of which 8 were in the typical epicrania fugax, 5 were in the atypical, nummular fleeting, and mixed were in the next lot. The classical headaches have been more common in females, though the atypical headaches don't have a characteristic sex predilection, and the attacks are almost similar across the group. The duration is less in typical epicrania fugax, and atypical forms have been found to have a variable duration. The atypical forms were commonly associated with other primary headache disorders like headache or classical neck pains. So it was difficult to say whether these headaches describe the wider phenotype of the already existing syndromes, or these are novel syndromes in themselves. That has to be classified, and maybe in future that we can do that. So treatment for these would be, first line, we can use painkillers like NSAIDs, indomethacin, celecoxib, etc. If they don't respond to these drugs, neuromodulating agents have been known to be effective, like pregabalin, gabapentin, carbamazepine, lamotrigine, and even topiramate. And for certain refractory cases, there have been case reports which have responded to peripheral nerve blocks and botulinum neurotoxins. So now I'd like to call upon our respected HOD sir, Dr. Sunil Pradhan sir, for the closing statements.
As has already been discussed, we discussed today a lot of different types of pain syndromes, and they appear to be quite intriguing in a sense that they don't really have a direct cause and effect relationship. But if you go into the depth, you will find that the pain has always been intriguing thing for the human beings. And historically, even in the wars, when the enemies used to kill their enemies, when there was some injury inflicted, the greatest mercy that enemy used to show his enemy was to behead him so that he is relieved of the pain. So pain is something which has always been very important thing for the human beings. And even in the animals, it has been found that this pain has a lot of correlation with the autonomic nervous system. And it is also like a defense mechanism, as when a prey falls to a predator, then it has been found that sometimes the prey dies even before the predator catches him, and that's because of the fear of the pain, or sometimes it's the pain itself which can lead to autonomic stimulation, and the child may die, the animal may die. So if you go into the anatomy, you will find that the pain fibers and autonomic fibers, they both are there is no myelin sheath over them, and that way anatomically they are quite similar. And several times the sensory fibers have taken up the function of the autonomic nervous system, in a sense that in migraine, now we know that in CRPS, in migraine cases, the in the trigeminal autonomic cephalgia, which has been discussed today, the nerve endings which are supposed to take sensory functions from the vessels, they in fact produce some biochemical changes at that level in the form of release of CGRP, nitric oxide, and VIP. So there is a close communication between the autonomic nervous system and the pain pathways. It's at the level of the peripheral nervous system. It is also at the level of the spinal cord, where the roots, the sensory roots communicate with the autonomic chain, and at the thalamic level also there is a communication between thalamus and the hypothalamus. So because of that, there is a very close correlation, and today we have seen that how the severe pains may lead to autonomic changes because of this. So it's a very interesting thing, and but at the same time, it also depends on how you manage these patients, because once you know that there is a correlation between the sensory nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, then the treatment modalities are also guided accordingly. Thank you.